You just got paid. You worked all month. You showed up. You did the work. You earned the money. And then before you even touched it, someone took a piece. You did not agree to it. Nobody called you beforehand to ask permission. There was no negotiation, no conversation, no polite request. A percentage of your labor converted into money was removed from your paycheck by an entity you have never met, deposited into an account you will never see, and spent on things you may or may not have voted for. You have been doing this your entire working life. Your parents did it, their parents did it, and almost nobody ever stops to ask the obvious question. Who was the first person to look at someone else's harvest, someone else's labor, someone else's earnings, and say, I'm taking a portion of that? And how did everyone else just go along with it? So how did humans invent tax? The answer is older than money, older than writing, older than civilization itself. And here's the uncomfortable part. Civilization might not exist without it. Let's start with what came before, because for most of human history, nobody paid taxes. For roughly 290,000 of our species' 300,000-year existence, humans lived in small mobile bands of 20 to 50 related individuals. No government, no bureaucracy, no treasury, no tax code. You hunted, you gathered, you shared what you had with the people around you because they were your family, and because tomorrow you might be the one who came back empty-handed. Anthropologists call this generalized reciprocity or sometimes demand sharing. If you killed a large animal, you did not keep it. You distributed it, not because someone forced you to, but because social pressure made it effectively impossible not to. If you hoarded food while others went hungry, your own group would mock you, ostracize you, or simply stop cooperating with you. And in a world where survival depends on cooperation, social exclusion is a death sentence. But here is the part that matters for the story of taxes. That sharing was voluntary, or at least it was enforced by social norms, not by an institution with a ledger and an enforcement arm. There was no chief collecting a portion, no temple demanding a cut, no scribe recording what you owed. For tens of thousands of years, humans redistributed resources without anything resembling a tax system. The reason is simple. A tax requires something those societies did not have: a state. So how did the state appear? And why did it immediately start taking people's things? The answer begins with a plant, specifically grain. James C. Scott, a political scientist at Yale, published a book in 2017 called Against the Grain that makes an argument most people have never considered. Scott argues that the first states formed specifically around cereal grains, not yams, not cassava, not fruit trees, grain. And the reason has nothing to do with nutrition. It has everything to do with visibility. Wheat stands in a field, ripening all at once, visible to anyone who walks past. You can estimate the size of a harvest by looking at it. You can measure it, weigh it, divide it, store it in a granary, and transport it to a palace. In other words, wheat can be taxed. A yam growing underground is invisible. You can leave it in the dirt and dig it up whenever you want. Nobody can count your yams from the road. But wheat announces itself. It stands there, golden, measurable, exposed. Scott's argument is that the state at its foundation is a grain tax collection operation. Everything else, the borders, the armies, the bureaucracies, the written laws, exists to make that taxation possible. Think about that. Every government form you have ever filled out, every tax bracket, every argument about fiscal policy on the news, it traces back, at least in part, to the fact that wheat is easy to count. And here's where the connection between tax and writing becomes genuinely startling, because writing was not invented for poetry, it was not invented for prayer, it was not invented to record myths or love stories or philosophical arguments. Writing was invented to track who owed what. Denise Schmant-Besserat, an archaeologist who spent decades studying the origins of writing, published her findings in a 1992 book called Before Writing. She traced the entire evolution of writing back to small clay tokens found across the Near East, some dating as far back as 8000 BC. These tokens were shaped to represent specific quantities of specific goods. A cone for a small measure of barley, a sphere for a large measure, a cylinder for an animal. They were the world's oldest accounting system, and they were used to record obligations, who owed what to whom, how much had been collected, how much was still outstanding. Over centuries, administrators began sealing these tokens inside hollow clay balls called bullae, then pressing the tokens into the surface of the ball before sealing it so you could verify the contents without breaking it open. Eventually, the impressions replaced the tokens entirely. People started pressing symbols directly into flat clay tablets. Those symbols became cuneiform. The first written language in human history emerged from an accounting office. The first word ever written was almost certainly not God or love or war. It was probably a number next to a picture of a bag of barley. Writing was born as a tax receipt. Now, with writing came records, and with records came the oldest known tax systems on Earth. In Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq and Syria, the Sumerian city-state of Lagash produced some of the earliest surviving tax documents, clay tablets dating to the 3rd millennium BC. These tablets record assessments of grain, livestock, and labor owed to the temple and the palace. Taxes were collected by priests and administrators, and the revenue funded canal construction, military campaigns, temple maintenance, and the feeding of the entire non-farming class that ran the bureaucracy. The system was sophisticated. It had categories, it had assessment schedules, it had penalties for non-payment, and it had, inevitably, corruption. During the 3rd dynasty of Ur, roughly 2112 to 2004 BC, the system became even more elaborate. The state operated an interprovincial exchange system in which each province was required to deliver specific quantities of goods to the central government on a rotating basis. Grain, livestock, textiles, silver, all tracked. All recorded on clay tablets by scribes who spent their entire careers counting other people's property. The administrative archives from this period are enormous. Tens of thousands of tablets documenting the flow of taxed goods from provinces to the capital, and every single tablet is, when you strip away the cuneiform, a tax form. And this is where the first recorded tax revolt enters the story. Around 2350 BC, a ruler named Urukagina took power in Lagash and did something no leader had publicly done before. He cut taxes. The texts that survive from his reign describe a city groaning under the weight of fees and levies imposed by corrupt officials. Temple administrators had been charging fees for everything: funerals, divorces, perfume, wool. If you wanted to bury your dead, you paid a fee. If you wanted to end a marriage, you paid a fee. Urukagina eliminated many of these charges and reduced others. His reform texts are the oldest known legal reforms in human history. And they are, when you read them carefully, a campaign speech. I got rid of the taxes that were crushing you. 5,000 years ago, a politician ran on tax cuts. The strategy, apparently, is timeless. But the most elaborate ancient tax system belonged to Egypt. Around 3000 BC, the pharaohs developed a taxation apparatus so thorough that it shaped nearly every aspect of Egyptian life. The system revolved around the Nile. Every year, the river flooded, depositing rich silt across the farmland on either side. Egyptian engineers built devices called nilometers, stone gauges set into the riverbank or on islands in the Nile to measure the height of the annual flood. A higher flood meant more fertile land, which meant a larger expected harvest, which meant higher taxes. A lower flood meant less fertility, lower yields, and a reduction in what the pharaoh could demand. The tax rate was not arbitrary. It was calibrated to the river. Nature set the assessment. The pharaoh collected. Think about the sophistication of that. They were not guessing. They were measuring a natural phenomenon and using it to calculate an appropriate rate of taxation. That is, economic modeling performed 4,000 years before anyone used the term. Egyptian scribes recorded tax obligations on papyrus and issued receipts on ostraka, broken pottery shards used as cheap writing material, tax receipts written on garbage. If that does not tell you something about how governments have always viewed the act of acknowledging what they took from you, nothing will. The Wilbur Papyrus, dating to roughly 1147 BC, during the reign of Ramesses V, is one of the most detailed tax documents surviving from the ancient world. It records land assessments, expected grain yields, and tax obligations for a stretch of territory in Upper Egypt. Every field measured, every farmer named, every bushel accounted for. It is, in every meaningful sense, an ancient spreadsheet, and Egypt did not just tax grain, it taxed labor. The corvée system required ordinary Egyptians to contribute a set number of days each year to state construction projects. The pyramids at Giza were not built by slaves, as the old myth insists. Archaeological evidence, including worker villages, bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities excavated near the pyramid complex by Egyptologist Mark Lehner and his team, shows that the builders were organized laborers fulfilling their tax obligations. You did not write a check to the pharaoh. You hauled a stone, your body was the payment. Now, here is a detail that reframes one of the most famous objects in any museum on Earth: the Rosetta Stone. That artifact sitting in the British Museum, the object that cracked the code of Egyptian hieroglyphics, the single most celebrated linguistic breakthrough in the history of archaeology. It is a tax document. The text on the Rosetta Stone is a decree issued in 196 BC by King Ptolemy V. Among other things, it announces tax exemptions and financial concessions for temples and priests. The most important stone in the history of language exists because a government wanted to publicize its tax policy. 3 scripts, 3 languages, 1 message: your taxes have been adjusted. That is the Rosetta Stone. And while Egypt was perfecting its grain tax, on the other side of the continent, China was inventing a completely different approach to the same problem. Rather than sending collectors to every farm, Chinese dynasties discovered something that would become one of the most powerful revenue tools in the history of government: the state monopoly. During the Han Dynasty, roughly 206 BC to 220 AD, the government established monopolies on salt and iron, 2 commodities that every person in the empire needed and could not easily produce on their own. You want salt? Buy it from the government. You want iron tools? Buy them from the government. The revenue was enormous, and the principle was elegant. Instead of deploying an army of tax collectors to every household, you control the supply of something essential and take your cut at the source. It is the same logic behind modern excise taxes on gasoline, alcohol, and tobacco. China figured it out over 2,000 years ago. The approach evolved over centuries. During the Tang Dynasty, roughly 618 to 907 AD, Chancellor Yang Yan implemented what became known as the two-tax reform, shifting the basis of taxation from head counts to actual wealth and land ownership. The tax was collected twice a year, once in summer and once in autumn. That single reform, moving from how many people live here to how much is this land actually worth, was a conceptual leap that most Western tax systems would not make for another 1,000 years. In Greece, the approach was different again. Athenian democracy had an almost allergic reaction to direct taxation of its own citizens. Free citizens were not supposed to pay regular direct taxes. That was considered the mark of a subject, not a free man. Instead, Athens relied on trade tariffs, harbor dues, and a special levy called the eisphora, a wealth tax imposed only on the richest citizens and only during military emergencies. But the most interesting Greek contribution to the history of tax is something called a liturgy. Wealthy Athenians were expected to personally fund public projects, warships, theatrical festivals, athletic competitions, not because the government demanded it on paper, but because your reputation and political standing depended on your generosity. You funded a warship because your neighbors would remember if you did not. It was taxation by social pressure, which, if you think about it, is exactly how hunter-gatherers had been distributing resources for tens of thousands of years, just with bigger budgets and fancier boats. And then there were the Romans. And the Romans, as they did with most things, took taxation and turned it into an industry. During the Republic, Rome did not collect its own taxes. It outsourced the job. Private contractors called publicani bid for the right to collect taxes in specific provinces. The winning bidder paid the state a fixed sum up front, then went to the province and collected as much as he could, keeping the difference as profit. If this sounds like a system custom-built to produce corruption and abuse, that is because it was. The publicani squeezed provinces until there was nothing left to squeeze. Cicero, the Roman statesman and orator, wrote extensively about the devastation they caused. Provincial populations despised them. The system generated revenue for Rome and misery for everyone under Rome. When Augustus became the first emperor in 27 BC, he reformed the system. He reduced the role of the publicani, conducted a census of the empire's population and property, and shifted toward a state-managed tax apparatus run by provincial governors and local officials called decurions. It was still taxation, but it was taxation with at least a thin layer of accountability between the people collecting and the people paying. Augustus understood something that many rulers before and after him failed to grasp. If you want to tax people indefinitely, you have to leave them enough to survive. A dead taxpayer pays nothing. Here is something that connects every one of these ancient systems to whatever tax debate is happening right now, today, wherever you live. In the 14th century, a North African scholar named Ibn Khaldun wrote a book called the Muqaddimah, published in 1377. In it, he described a relationship between tax rates and government revenue that modern economists would not formally articulate for another 600 years. He observed that at the beginning of a dynasty, when taxes are low, economic activity flourishes and total revenue is high. Over time, the dynasty raises rates to fund its growing appetites. People produce less. Commerce shrinks. And paradoxically, total revenue falls even though the rates are higher. Low rates, high revenue. High rates, low revenue. In the 1970s, an American economist named Arthur Laffer drew this exact relationship on a napkin during a dinner in Washington, and it became known as the Laffer curve. It influenced Ronald Reagan's economic policy. It reshaped American fiscal debate for a generation, and Ibn Khaldun had written the same idea 6 centuries earlier, in Arabic, in a masterwork of political philosophy that most Western economists had never read. Laffer himself later acknowledged the historical precedent. A medieval scholar solved a problem that cable news pundits still argue about every single night. In medieval Europe, taxation took forms that would be barely recognizable today, but that produced political structures we still live under. The feudal system was, at its foundation, a tax arrangement. Kings granted land to lords. Lords granted land to vassals. Vassals extracted labor, goods, and military service from the peasants who worked the soil. At every level, wealth flowed upward. The church collected tithes, 1/10 of a person's income or produce, enforced by religious obligation and social pressure. Between feudal dues and church tithes, a medieval peasant could easily surrender 30 to 50% of everything they produced. Sound familiar? In 1086, William the Conqueror commissioned the Domesday Book, a comprehensive survey of all landholdings in England, every estate, every manor, every mill, every fish pond, every plow team. Its purpose was explicitly fiscal. William wanted to know exactly what he could tax. The survey was so thorough and so final that the English named it after the Day of Judgment because, like God's judgment, there was no appeal. The most complete census of a nation's taxable wealth conducted in the medieval world was done not out of curiosity, but out of greed. The king wanted his money, and in 1215, taxation produced one of the most consequential documents in the history of political liberty. King John of England had been imposing heavy, arbitrary taxes to fund military campaigns in France. His campaigns failed. The taxes did not stop. His barons had enough. They forced him to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede on June 15, 1215. Among its provisions was a requirement that the king could not levy certain taxes, specifically scutage, a fee paid in lieu of military service, without the consent of the Common Council of the realm. That single clause, the idea that a ruler cannot tax without the agreement of the taxed, became the seed of constitutional government. Parliament grew out of it. Representative democracy grew out of it. Every democratic tax debate you have ever witnessed is a descendant of that clause, written on parchment because an English king pushed his barons one levy too far. And while we are on the subject of taxes that people would not tolerate, let me tell you about some taxes that border on absurd. In 1696, the English Parliament imposed a tax on windows. The more windows your house had, the more you paid. The logic was that windows were a proxy for wealth. Bigger houses had more windows, and unlike income, windows were easy to count from the street. The response was immediate and predictable. People bricked up their windows. Walk through any old English city today, and you will see buildings with bricked-over window openings still visible after 3 centuries. People chose to live in darkness rather than pay the tax. The window tax was not repealed until 1851, after public health reformers argued that it was literally making people sick by blocking light and ventilation. A tax designed to count wealth ended up counting stubbornness. In 1698, Tsar Peter the Great of Russia imposed a tax on beards. He wanted to modernize Russia along Western European lines, and that meant clean-shaven faces. If you wanted to keep your beard, you paid an annual fee and carried a special copper token proving you had paid. The token read, "The beard is a superfluous burden." Peter taxed facial hair to reshape a culture. And the genuinely strange part is that it worked. Within a generation, most Russian aristocrats were clean-shaven. These sound like historical curiosities. They are not. They are demonstrations of the same principle that governs every tax policy in the modern world. When you tax something, you get less of it. When you subsidize something, you get more of it. The English got fewer windows. The Russians got fewer beards. The principle has not changed. Only the targets have now. The history of taxation is, in many ways, the history of people deciding they have been taxed enough. In 1381, England imposed a flat-rate poll tax to fund the 100 Years' War. Every person over the age of 15 owed the same amount, regardless of wealth. The tax fell equally on the rich and the poor, which meant it fell hardest on those who had the least. The result was the Peasants' Revolt. An army of commoners, led in part by a man named Wat Tyler, marched on London. They burned buildings. They killed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Treasurer. They confronted the 14-year-old King Richard II at Smithfield. Tyler was stabbed to death during the meeting. The revolt collapsed. But the poll tax was abandoned. The peasants lost the battle and won the argument. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring American colonists to pay a tax on virtually every piece of printed paper. Newspapers, legal documents, playing cards. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament. Nobody in London had asked their opinion. The response was a phrase that became the philosophical foundation of a revolution: no taxation without representation. The principle is simple. If you're going to take my money, I get a voice in how it is spent. That principle led to the Boston Tea Party in December 1773, when colonists dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor rather than pay the tax on it. It led to the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. It led to the creation of a nation whose founding grievance, before anything about liberty or the pursuit of happiness, was a tax dispute. The United States of America exists in a very direct sense because of an argument about the price of tea. And in France, the tax system was even more combustible. By the late 18th century, the French tax burden fell almost entirely on the third estate, the commoners. The nobility and the clergy were largely exempt. The gabelle, a despised salt tax, forced every household to purchase a minimum quantity of salt at a price set by the government. Workers in Paris spent up to 88% of their wages on bread alone. When harvest failures in 1788 and 1789 drove bread prices even higher, and the government still refused to tax the people who could actually afford it, the result was not a policy discussion. It was the French Revolution. The storming of the Bastille, the execution of a king, the complete destruction of the social order, all because the people who paid the taxes had finally decided that the people who did not pay them had no right to rule. 3 revolutions, 3 continents, 3 centuries, and the same cause. Someone taxed the wrong people, the wrong amount, and the system broke. Meanwhile, philosophers were trying to answer a question that the revolts had made impossible to ignore. Is taxation legitimate? And if so, why should anyone accept it? Thomas Hobbes, writing in 1651 in Leviathan, argued that without government, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Taxation, in Hobbes's view, is the price of civilization. You give the sovereign your money. The sovereign prevents you from being murdered by your neighbors. Unpleasant, but better than the alternative. John Locke, writing in 1689 in his second treatise of government, agreed that taxation was legitimate, but added a condition that changed everything. It must be levied with the consent of the governed. The purpose of government, Locke argued, is to protect natural rights, specifically life, liberty, and property. A government that taxes without consent is not protecting your property. It is taking it. This is the argument the American colonists used. This is the argument that is still being used in courtrooms and legislatures today. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing in 1762 in The Social Contract, pushed the idea further. He argued that taxation should serve the general will of the people and that it should be progressive. Those with more should pay more, not because they use more government services, but because a just society requires it. Every modern argument about progressive taxation, about whether the wealthy should pay higher rates than everyone else, is a footnote to Rousseau. Every political argument you have ever heard about taxes, every debate on the news, every angry comment under a policy article, all of it is a rehash of arguments that were first articulated in the 17th and 18th centuries. The terms change. The logic does not. Now, the modern income tax is surprisingly recent. For most of recorded history, governments taxed goods, land, trade, and labor. They taxed salt and windows and beards. But the idea that the government takes a flat percentage of what you earn, regardless of what form it takes, is a modern invention. The first modern income tax was introduced by British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger in 1799. He needed money to fight Napoleon. The tax applied to incomes above £60 per year at a rate of roughly 10%. It was supposed to be temporary. When the wars ended, it was repealed in 1816. Then it was reintroduced in 1842 by Robert Peel to cover a budget shortfall. And it never went away again. That pattern, a tax introduced for a specific emergency that quietly becomes permanent long after the emergency is over, has repeated itself in nearly every country that has ever imposed one. There is nothing more permanent than a temporary tax. In the United States, income tax had a rockier path. Congress introduced a temporary income tax during the Civil War in 1861. It expired. In 1894, Congress tried again. The Supreme Court struck it down the following year in Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Co., ruling that a federal income tax was unconstitutional because it was a direct tax not apportioned among the states by population. It took a constitutional amendment to fix it. The 16th Amendment, ratified on February 3, 1913, granted Congress the power to levy income taxes without apportionment. The first permanent federal income tax rate was 1% on incomes above $3,000, with a top rate of 7% on incomes above $500,000. Today, the top marginal rate in the United States is 37%. That original 1% did not stay at 1% for long. And there is one more thread in this story that most tax histories leave out entirely. The idea that debts and taxes should sometimes be forgiven. Michael Hudson, an economist at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, spent decades studying ancient Near Eastern economies. David Graeber, an anthropologist at the London School of Economics, wrote Debt, the First 5,000 Years, published in 2011. Both argued that ancient Mesopotamian and Babylonian societies regularly enacted what they called clean slates, royal decrees that canceled debts, freed debt slaves, and wiped tax arrears off the books. The Babylonian kings called these decrees Andurarum, the biblical tradition called it Jubilee, a periodic reset described in Leviticus 25, where debts were forgiven, slaves were freed, and land was returned to its original owners every 50 years. Hudson's research, published in his 2018 book, And Forgive Them Their Debts, showed that these cancellations were not charity. They were economic policy. When debts and back taxes accumulated to the point where ordinary people could not function, the entire economy seized up. Workers fled their fields to escape creditors. Land went unplanted. The tax base collapsed. The clean slate was not generosity. It was self-preservation. The ruler forgave the debts because the alternative was a kingdom with nobody left to tax. Think about what that means. 5,000 years ago, Babylonian kings understood something that modern governments still struggle with. You can only extract so much before the system breaks. And when it breaks, the people at the top lose more than the people at the bottom because the people at the bottom have nothing left to lose. So, the answer? How did humans invent tax? They did it in layers, each one building on the last, each one making the next one unavoidable. First, they settled down and grew grain, creating a surplus that was visible, measurable, and portable. Then someone realized that controlling that surplus meant controlling power. Then they needed to track who owed what, so they invented writing, literally creating the written word as a tool for tax accounting. Then temples and palaces formalized collection into systems with scribes, assessments, penalties, and receipts scratched onto broken pottery. Then empires scaled those systems across continents, funding armies and roads and aqueducts and bureaucracies that could not exist without revenue. Then people revolted when the burden became unbearable, and those revolts produced constitutional limits on the power to tax. Then philosophers justified taxation as part of a social contract, the price you pay for not living in chaos. Then governments invented income tax to fund wars and never repealed it. And somewhere along the way, taxation became so deeply embedded in the structure of civilization that most people stopped questioning whether it should exist and started arguing only about how much it should be. Was the invention of tax inevitable? Almost certainly. Given agriculture, surplus, population growth, and the need for collective infrastructure, some form of compulsory resource extraction was going to emerge wherever states formed. The probability is above 95%. Every civilization that independently developed agriculture, independently developed taxation, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, the Inca, Mesoamerica, nobody taught them. They all arrived at the same answer because the problem is universal. When you have surplus, someone will organize to control it. And when someone controls the surplus, they will tax the people who produce it. The specific forms, income taxes versus grain taxes versus salt monopolies versus corvée labor, those were accidents of history, geography, and politics. But the core concept that the group takes a share of individual production to fund collective needs was coming no matter what. Tonight or tomorrow, or whenever your next paycheck arrives, a piece of it will vanish before you see it. It will go to a government that will spend it on roads or schools or military equipment or things you would never have chosen to fund yourself. You will not be asked. You will not be consulted. You will simply pay. And you will do it because roughly 5,000 years ago, a scribe in southern Mesopotamia pressed a reed stylus into a wet clay tablet and recorded how much barley a farmer owed to a temple. That was the first tax return. And every tax return since, including yours, is a direct descendant of that moment. The only thing that has changed is the medium. Clay became papyrus. Papyrus became paper. Paper became a screen. The tax never went away. It just learned to keep up. If this answered a question you have been curious about, hit the like button and share it with someone who would find it interesting. Subscribe if you want to see more of these, and leave a comment telling me what we should try next. Now, taxes needed someone to collect them. Someone with authority, someone with a title. If you want to know how that happened, go watch How Did Humans Invent Kings, appearing on your screen right now.